Hello again everybody, and another Roman festival today. This was probably the most popular of them all and certainly one of the longest, and it was called the Saturnalia. It's another festival whose origins are obscure, but it's somehow connected with agriculture and fertility, perhaps with the time of sowing crops on the winter solstice. The historian Livy suggests it was actually started in the 5th century BC, but other ancient writers suggest that it goes right back to the golden age of Saturn. It's sometime in the mythical past. Now Saturn, the golden age of Saturn was looked back to by a lot of Roman authors as a sign, a time when everything was good and supplies of everything were plentiful, and interestingly there was no slavery. So it's interesting also in that kind of traces its origins back to a mythical past rather than looking to a historical event, as we heard about in the Lupercalia yesterday. The Roman rituals had Greek elements added to them after the disastrous Battle of Lake Trasimene in 217 BC. The Romans consulted the Sibylline books, the oracular books, and the Sibylline book said you need to introduce some Greek rituals into the Saturnalia, and so they did. And these included things like a priest sacrificing while bareheaded, because usually Roman priests pulled a veil over their head, lots of shouting of Yo Saturnalia, and a big public banquet. No writer gives a day-by-day account of what actually went on at the Saturnalia, but we can piece together the various elements of it, and it's a festival which evolved over a period of time. Sometimes rituals stayed the same, sometimes things were added, as we've just heard, sometimes they were taken away, sometimes even the length of the festival changed. So usually festivals last one day, but in the case of the Saturnalia it was, we know, 7 days long. 1st century BC, Augustus decided it should be restricted to 3 days, Caligula restored it to 5 days, and as far as we know it continued in that sort of vein. But it might not have been the same length of festival wherever you went in the Roman Empire. It's widely held to be a lot more egalitarian than many religious festivals, because there was an active place to play for people of all classes, and even those who didn't qualify as people, so the slaves, freedmen, the lower classes as well as the middle and upper classes. There was also a place to play for women. The festival lasted, as we've heard, several days, beginning on the 17th of December, and it led up to the winter solstice. Now you might be thinking that doesn't quite make sense, and what's it got to do with December 25th, which comes into this also? Well, in the older Julian calendar, the pre-Gregorian calendar, the winter solstice actually fell on what we would now call December 25th, so it's starting to come together in that way. Festival started with a sacrifice, if you're in Rome, at the Temple of Saturn. Elsewhere, of course, if you haven't got a Temple of Saturn, there's just a sacrifice. So that involves the death of a pig and subsequent butchering of this animal and a public feast. Normal rules of behaviour were suspended for the duration of the festival. Now this included the judicial system was suspended, there were no trials, there were no official public engagements, but a great deal else changed and was suspended, and that might be one of the reasons for its popularity. The statue of Saturn in the temple in Rome had a woolen band around its ankles, and this was formally and ceremonially loosened for the duration of the festival, and we now think that symbolises a loosening of the normal rules of behaviour and conduct. There were meals at which masters may have served slaves, or it may have been children of the familia, the household, served by adults. Now our evidence for this comes from a writer called Macrobius, who was writing in the 5th century AD, and this is what he said. Meanwhile, the head of the slave household, whose responsibility it was to offer sacrifices to the Penates, who were kind of the store-cupboard gods, to manage the provisions and to direct the activities of the domestic servants, came to tell his master that the household had feasted according to the annual ritual custom. For at this festival, in houses that keep to proper religious usage, they first of all honoured the slaves with a dinner prepared as if for their master, and only afterwards is the table set again for the head of the household. So then the chief slave came in to announce the time of dinner and to summon the master to table. So not quite dining at the same table, but at least giving some privileges to slaves over their usual slavers, their masters. There were traditional games played within the household. Does that sound like Christmas board games, anybody? Gambling in public was allowed and not restricted to gambling on chariot racing at the circus. There was a lot of drinking, and especially drinking to excess. It was allowed, perhaps even expected, and this may even have been allowed for slaves. It was a very noisy business. The writer Pliny tried to soundproof a room so that he could continue working undisturbed by all the partygoers. At the end of the festival, gifts were exchanged, traditionally sigilla, little statuettes, in a ritual called the sigillarium, but some gifts became more substantial, and valuable gifts of silver are mentioned by the epigrammatist Martial. Silver spoon is regarded as mean. He also sarcastically thanks his friend Humbert for sending a whole list of items, including toothpicks, a sponge, and bags of olives and beans, and says he'd have rather had silver. And there was also the selection of a princeps Saturnalis, so that's a kind of king of the festival. Perhaps that's the forerunner of the English medieval Lord of Misrule, because the princeps Saturnalis was expected to preside over all kinds of hijinks and goings-on that would normally be considered out of order. All of this, of course, returned to normal at the end of the festival, and some modern scholars have suggested that allowing people to let off steam was a means of social control, if you like, an opiate for the people. Either way, it was very popular, as this extract from the 1st century AD poet colourfully confirms. Amid such excitements and strange luxuries, the pleasure of the scene flies quickly by. Women untrained to the sword take their stand, daring how recklessly men's battles. Then comes a bold array of dwarves. They give and suffer wounds and threaten death with fists how tiny. Now as the shades of night draw on, what commotion attends the scattering of largesse. Here enter maidens easily bought. Here is recognised all that in theatres wins favour or applause for skill or beauty. Here a crowd of buxom Lydian girls are clapping hands. Here tinkle the cymbals of Cadiz. There troops of Syrians are making uproar. There are theatre folk, and they who barter common sulphur for broken glass, i.e. junk dealers. Countless voices are raised to heaven acclaiming the Emperor's Saturnalia festival. With loving enthusiasm they salute their lord. For how many years shall this festival abide? Never shall age destroy so holy a day. While the hills of Latium remain and farther Tiber, while your Rome stands and the capital you have restored to the world, it shall continue. So Statius clearly loved it. And Christmas. What about Christmas? There's no literary evidence that the Christian Church formally adapted the commemoration of the birth of Jesus to the Saturnalia. But if we consider the traditions and rituals of our midwinter festival nowadays, it's not hard to compare the gift-giving, the feasting and drinking, the role reversals, and even the idea of the Lord of Misrule. So the popular modern Christmas, it seems to me, is just Saturnalia by another name.